What if the stray beast you fed every night in the freezing woods was actually the most feared ruler in the realm? She thought she was saving a dying, mangy wolf. She didn't know she was binding her soul to the exiled Alpha King. This is a story of ultimate betrayal. The winter of 1345 was unforgiving, burying the remote village of Darrowshire under 3 feet of relentless icy snow. In this desolate corner of the world, survival was a daily war, and for Rowena, it was a war she fought on 2 fronts. Orphaned at a young age, she was the ward of her uncle, Barnaby, a bitter, heavy-handed tanner who saw her as little more than free labor and a punching bag for his drunken frustrations. Rowena spent her days scrubbing blood-stained vats and her evenings foraging in the dangerous, wolf-infested tree line of the Whispering Woods, desperate to find enough wild tubers and frozen berries to keep herself from starving. It was during one of these desperate twilight excursions that her life fractured and rebuilt itself forever. The wind was howling, biting through her threadbare woolen cloak, when she noticed the blood. It wasn't the scattered, frozen droplets of a wounded rabbit. This blood was thick, nearly black in the fading light, melting deep craters into the pristine snow. Against her better judgment, and defying every terrifying legend the village elders whispered about the beasts of the woods, Rowena followed the trail. It led her down into a jagged, rocky ravine, shielded from the wind by ancient pine roots. There, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, lay a monster. Rowena froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was a wolf, but its size defied logic. The creature was as large as a draft horse, its coat a mesmerizing blend of midnight black and frost-tipped silver. But it was dying. Protruding from its massive muscular shoulder was a thick, silver-tipped crossbow bolt, the kind used by royal mercenaries, not local hunters. The flesh around the wound was blackened, pulsing with a sick, unnatural heat that melted the snow beneath the beast. The wolf's head snapped toward her. Its eyes, piercing, intelligent, and the color of molten amber, locked onto hers. A low, bone-rattling snarl vibrated through the ravine, but the effort caused the beast to collapse, a whimper escaping its bloody jaws. Rowena should have run. The laws of nature dictated that she flee. Yet, as she looked into those golden eyes, she saw something that paralyzed her with empathy. Profound, agonizing betrayal. It was a look she knew intimately, having endured Barnaby's cruelties for years. "I'm not going to hurt you," Rowena whispered, her voice trembling as she dropped her foraging basket. She fell to her knees in the snow, slowly inching forward. "If I leave you, you will freeze, or the rot will take you." The beast bared its fangs, snapping its jaws inches from her face. The sheer force of its breath smelled of iron and pine. Rowena didn't flinch. She reached out with trembling, frost-cracked hands and grasped the wooden shaft of the crossbow bolt. The wolf went completely still, its golden eyes widening as it watched her. "Hold on," she breathed. With a sharp, violent yank, she pulled the silver bolt free. The wolf roared in agony, its massive jaws snapping shut on Rowena's shoulder. She screamed, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for her bones to snap. But the pressure was controlled. The beast held her gently in its teeth, a warning rather than an attack, before slowly releasing her and slumping into the snow, utterly exhausted. Using her apron, Rowena packed the wound with snow and crushed yarrow she had gathered weeks prior, binding it tightly. Before she left, she took the only piece of food she had, a heel of stale, hard bread and a scrap of salted mutton she had stolen from Barnaby's larder, and placed it by the beast's snout. That night, she slipped back into her uncle's draughty hovel, her clothes soaked in blood and snow, her heart racing. She fully expected the wolf to be dead by morning, but a strange, invisible tether had been forged in that ravine. The next evening, compelled by a force she couldn't explain, Rowena returned. The wolf was still there. It was weak, but alive. And to her utter shock, the bread and mutton were gone. Thus began a dangerous, secret pact. Every night, while Barnaby snored in a drunken stupor, Rowena braved the freezing temperatures. She smuggled scraps of meat, warm broth in a clay flask, and fresh poultices made of comfrey and bindweed. She sat in the dark, damp cave, feeding the beast by hand. She never knew that beneath the matted fur and the savage exterior was Gareth, the overthrown alpha king of the northern reaches. Ambushed by his own royal guard and poisoned by a silver-laced weapon orchestrated by his treacherous half-brother Ewan, Gareth had been forced to shift to survive the blood loss. The silver in his bloodstream had trapped him in his wolf form, stripping him of his voice and his humanity, leaving him to die like a common animal in the dirt. But Gareth retained his human mind. Every night, as this fragile, bruised human girl brought him food at the risk of her own life, his cynical, battle-hardened heart began to thaw. He noticed the bruises on her wrists. He noticed how she gave him the largest pieces of meat, leaving almost nothing for herself. To Rowena, he was a wounded animal. To Gareth, she was becoming his savior, his obsession, and his reason to reclaim his throne. 3 weeks bled into 4, and the brutal winter showed no signs of relenting. But inside the hidden ravine, life was thriving against all odds. Gareth's strength was returning. The blackened flesh around his shoulder had healed into a jagged, hairless scar, and the silver poison was finally working its way out of his system. He was massive, powerful, and utterly terrifying to behold. Yet around Rowena, he moved with the gentle precision of a shadow. Rowena had come to rely on the quiet sanctuary of the cave. Her life in Darrowshire was rapidly deteriorating. Barnaby's debts at the local tavern had caught up to him, and his temper had grown violently unpredictable. The only peace Rowena found was in the dark, buried beside the massive, warm body of the wolf. She had started talking to him, treating the silent beast as her only confidant. "Uncle Barnaby struck me again today," Rowena whispered one evening, her fingers absent-mindedly buried in the thick, soft fur at the nape of the wolf's neck. She leaned her head against his rib cage, listening to his deep, rhythmic heartbeat. "He says he cannot afford to feed me through the winter. He's been speaking with Lord Hastings. Hastings is a cruel man. He's thrice my age and has buried 4 wives. Barnaby plans to sell me to him to clear his ledgers." A low, rumbling growl vibrated through Gareth's chest. His massive head snapped up, his golden eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He nudged her aggressively with his snout, letting out a sharp huff of hot air, licking a fresh purple bruise on her cheekbone with a rough tongue. The sheer, protective fury radiating from the beast shocked her. "It's just the way of the world, my brave boy," she sighed, forcing a sad smile. "There is no escaping it for a peasant girl. At least I have known some kindness with you." Gareth closed his eyes, masking the violent, murderous thoughts swirling in his mind. Hastings. He knew the name. A corrupt, bloated lesser lord who had always skimmed taxes from the royal coffers. If Gareth had his human voice, he would have sworn a blood oath to tear Hastings' throat out. He was the rightful king, He had commanded armies that made the earth shake. Yet here he was, powerless to stop a drunken tanner from selling the woman who held his soul. The urgency to heal, to force the silver out of his veins and shift back into his human form, became a maddening obsession. But the real world was closing in on Darrowshire. The following morning, the village square was thrown into chaos. A detachment of the royal guard, bearing the crest of the usurper King Ewan, rode into the muddy plaza. They were led by Captain Braddock, a ruthless mercenary known for burning villages that harbored traitors. From the shadows of the tannery, Rowena watched as Braddock nailed a heavy parchment to the tavern door. By order of King Ewan, any citizen possessing knowledge of the rebel beast, a black and silver wolf of unnatural size, shall come forward. The creature is carrying a plague. Anyone found harboring this beast will be executed for high treason. Rowena's blood ran cold. The royal guard wasn't hunting a wild animal. They were hunting her wolf. The silver bolt she had pulled from his shoulder. It wasn't a hunter's mistake. It was an assassination attempt. Panic seized her. She had to warn him. She had to tell him to run deeper into the mountains. But as she turned to pack a satchel with supplies, a heavy, calloused hand clamped around the back of her neck. Barnaby yanked her backward, throwing her violently onto the dirt floor of the tannery. "Where do you think you're going with my provisions, you little thief?" Barnaby spat, his breath reeking of cheap ale. He noticed the satchel overflowing with salted meats and heavy wool. "Please, Uncle," Rowena begged, scrambling backward. "I was only organizing the cellar." "Liar!" Barnaby roared, kicking her hard in the ribs. Rowena gasped, curling into a ball as pain flared through her torso. "I knew you were stealing from me. Pity. I won't have you looking bruised for Lord Hastings tomorrow morning. He's sending his carriage at first light. Until then, you can rot in the dark." He dragged her by her hair, ignoring her desperate screams, and threw her down the steep wooden stairs into the root cellar. The heavy oak door slammed shut above her, plunging her into absolute darkness. The lock clicked heavily into place. Hours passed. The temperature in the cellar plummeted. Rowena huddled in the corner, weeping not for her own fate, but for the wolf. The sun had set. The moon was rising. It was the time she always went to the ravine. If she didn't show up, he might think she had abandoned him. Or worse, he might wander out looking for her and be spotted by Braddock's men. Miles away, in the icy ravine, Gareth paced. The moon reached its peak, casting long, silver shadows across the snow. She was late. Rowena was never late. Gareth sniffed the air, catching the faint, distant scent of burning torches, horse sweat, and cheap ale coming from the village. But beneath it all, his heightened senses caught something that made his blood freeze. The scent of Rowena's fear, and the unmistakable tang of her blood. The final remnants of the silver poison seemed to burn away in the fires of his absolute rage. The gentle, wounded animal she had nursed back to health died in that moment. The Alpha King awoke. Gareth stepped out of the ravine, his massive paws crunching heavily in the snow. He didn't care about Captain Braddock. He didn't care about the royal guards, or the swords, or the arrows. He looked down at the tiny, flickering lights of Darrowshire in the valley below. They had touched what was his, and tonight the snow in the village would run red. The descent from the treacherous, icy peaks of the Whispering Woods was a masterclass in predatory stealth, an ancient instinct awakening within the massive black and silver beast. Gareth moved not like a wounded animal, but like a localized avalanche of vengeance. his enormous paws completely silent against the deep powder of the snow. Below him, the secluded, miserable village of Darrowshire glowed with the sickening, yellow hue of cheap tallow torches. The bitter wind carried the raucous, drunken laughter of King Ewan's royal guard, spilling out from the local tavern and poisoning the pristine winter air. They were celebrating a hunt they had not yet won, boasting of silver blades and royal bounties, completely oblivious to the legendary monster stalking toward them in the dark. Inside the freezing root cellar beneath the tannery, Rowena shivered uncontrollably, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. The darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating, smelling of damp earth, rotting potatoes, and the copper tang of her own blood from Barnaby's brutal kick. Every breath she drew felt like swallowing broken glass, her bruised ribs protesting with fiery agony. Yet, amidst her own physical suffering, her mind remained frantically anchored to the ravine. She pictured the magnificent beast waiting for her in the snow, his golden eyes scanning the tree line, wondering why the only human who had ever shown him mercy had suddenly abandoned him to the freezing elements. She prayed to the old gods of the forest that he would stay hidden, that his primal instincts would warn him of the heavily armed mercenaries swarming the village square above. Suddenly, the distant, drunken singing from the tavern abruptly ceased. It was replaced by a sound that would haunt the nightmares of the surviving villagers for generations, a bone-chilling, earth-shattering roar that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of Darrowshire. It was not the howl of a mere timber wolf. It was the deafening battle cry of an apex predator claiming its absolute dominion. Rowena gasped, covering her ears as dirt sifted down from the cellar ceiling. The beast had not stayed in the mountains. He had come for her. Up in the village square, absolute carnage erupted. Captain Braddock, a seasoned mercenary who had slaughtered hundreds in the name of the usurper King Ewan, stepped out of the tavern just in time to see a shadow detach itself from the night. The beast was an absolute nightmare of muscle, fang, and fury. Before Braddock could even draw his silver-forged broadsword, the wolf lunged. The sheer kinetic impact of the monstrous creature threw the captain backward through the heavy wooden doors of the tavern, shattering the oak beams into deadly splinters. Chaos reigned supreme. Guardsmen scrambled, screaming in absolute terror as they tried to unsheathe their weapons, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Gareth moved with blinding, supernatural speed, a blur of midnight fur and flashing teeth. He did not kill indiscriminately. His heightened senses and human intellect guided his wrath. He targeted the royal crests on their armor, crippling the soldiers who sought to enforce his treacherous half-brother's rule, snapping swords with his jaws, and tossing heavily armored men aside like hollow dolls. Across the square, Barnaby the tanner peered through the frost-covered window of his hovel, his ruddy face completely drained of blood. The ale in his cup spilled unheeded onto the floorboards. The legends were undeniably real, and the monster was systematically dismantling the royal guard right outside his front door. Barnaby scrambled backward, desperately searching for the rusted iron pitchfork he kept by the fireplace, his cowardice overriding any shred of rational thought. Gareth, having decimated the guardsmen in the square, paused amidst the groaning bodies of his enemies. The residual silver in his system, which had kept him weakened for weeks, was completely incinerated by the raw, unstoppable adrenaline of his furious protective instincts. He closed his golden eyes, filtering through the overwhelming stench of blood, cheap ale, and wood smoke, searching for the one scent that mattered. Faintly, beneath the heavy scent of cured leather and animal hides, He caught it. Rowena's delicate scent, laced heavily with the sharp, acidic spike of profound terror. The heavy front door of the tannery exploded inward, ripped completely off its iron hinges by a single, devastating swipe of a massive paw. Barnaby shrieked, blindly thrusting the pitchfork forward. Gareth didn't even flinch. He caught the wooden shaft in his jaws, snapping it like a dry twig, before knocking the cruel tanner to the floor with a swift, heavy strike of his snout. Barnaby scrambled into the corner, weeping and begging for mercy from a creature he believed to be a mindless demon. Gareth ignored the pathetic, snivelling man. His massive head swung toward the heavy floorboards. He could hear her heart beat. It was frantic, fluttering like a trapped bird's, directly beneath his paws. With a low, rumbling growl, Gareth dug his massive, razor-sharp claws into the thick iron ring of the cellar trapdoor. The locks groaned in protest, but they were no match for the unnatural strength of the Alpha King. With a violent wrench, the heavy wooden door was torn free and tossed casually across the room. Rowena screamed as the sudden moonlight flooded her dark prison. She pressed herself completely flat against the damp dirt wall, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the king's men to drag her out to her execution. Instead, a heavy, warm breath washed over her face, carrying the familiar, comforting scent of pine needles and iron. She opened her eyes cautiously. Towering above her, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was the beast. His muzzle was stained with fresh blood, his breath pluming in the freezing air. But his golden eyes looked down at her with an astonishing softness that defied his terrifying appearance. He whined softly, a deep, resonant sound in his chest, and gently nudged her bruised cheek with his massive snout. "You came," Rowena whispered, her voice cracking with overwhelming emotion. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, freezing against her cold skin as she reached out, burying her trembling fingers into the thick, blood-matted fur at his neck. "You foolish, beautiful beast. You came for me." Gareth closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her touch. The bond was undeniable now. It pulsed through his veins, a magical resonance that tied his soul to this brave, resilient human girl. The need to protect her, to speak to her, became an overwhelming physical demand. He stepped backward into the center of the moonlight, spilling through the ruined doorway. Rowena watched in stunned, breathless silence as the air around the massive wolf began to shimmer with intense, unnatural heat. The sound was terrifying, a deep, heavy cracking of shifting bones and tearing ligaments. The midnight fur began to recede, melting into the moonlight as the beast's anatomy aggressively rearranged itself. Rowena pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a scream of pure shock, unable to look away from the violent, beautiful transformation. Where the monstrous, lethal beast had stood just moments before, there was now a man. He was breathtakingly imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a broad, powerfully built physique honed by years of relentless warfare. His skin was pale in the moonlight, crisscrossed with jagged silver scars of past battles. Thick, dark hair cascaded down his neck, framing a strong, aristocratic jawline and high, proud cheekbones. But it was his eyes that stole the breath straight from Rowena's lungs. They were the exact same piercing, molten amber as the wolf's. Gareth reached out, pulling a heavy woolen cloak from a nearby hook, and effortlessly draped it over his broad shoulders before turning his fierce, golden gaze to the terrified, bewildered girl still sitting in the dirt of the cellar. He extended a large, calloused hand toward her. "You have bled for me in the absolute darkness, little bird," Gareth spoke, his voice a deep, rough baritone that vibrated with suppressed emotion and undeniable command. "Now, I shall bleed for you in the light." Rowena stared at his outstretched hand, her mind completely fracturing as the impossible reality crashed down upon her. She had not been feeding a stray, discarded animal. She had been harboring a legend. The dawn broke over Darrowshire with an eerie, blood-soaked silence. The blinding white snow of the village square was severely marred by the chaotic aftermath of the night's brutal conflict. Groaning guardsmen lay scattered across the frozen mud, nursing broken bones and shattered pride, completely demoralized by the sheer, unstoppable force of the beast that had decimated their ranks in mere minutes. Inside the ruined tannery, Rowena sat by the hearth, a heavy woolen blanket wrapped tightly around her trembling shoulders. Gareth was pacing the length of the small room, his movements retaining the prowling, lethal grace of his wolf form. He had spent the remaining hours of the night explaining the treacherous, bloody reality of his existence. He revealed his true name, King Gareth of House Montgomery, the rightful Alpha Sovereign of the Northern Reaches. He detailed the vicious betrayal by his half-brother, Ewan, who had poisoned his wine with liquid silver and orchestrated a deadly ambush, forcing Gareth into a permanent, agonizing shift just to survive the escape. "I was resigned to a slow, humiliating death in that ravine," Gareth murmured, stopping his pacing to kneel before Rowena, his massive frame dwarfing her small, fragile form. He reached out, his long fingers gently tracing the dark, ugly bruise Barnaby had left on her cheekbone. His jaw tightened in barely suppressed fury at the sight of her injury. "You dragged me back from the abyss, Rowena. You gave me your food, your warmth, and your incredible courage when you had absolutely nothing to spare. You saved a king, and in doing so, you claimed his absolute devotion." Rowena swallowed hard, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. The man before her was a terrifying, mythical ruler, yet his touch was infinitely gentler than any human she had ever known. "I am merely a tanner's ward," she whispered, looking down at her rough, blistered hands. "I know nothing of kings or courts or royal devotions. I only knew that a magnificent creature was suffering, and I could not simply walk away." "Which is exactly why you are infinitely more worthy of a crown than anyone who currently resides in my stolen palace," Gareth replied fiercely, his golden eyes blazing with unyielding conviction. Their quiet moment was violently shattered by the heavy, rhythmic clatter of approaching hooves and the loud, obnoxious blast of a hunting horn. The sound echoed harshly through the quiet, devastated village. Rowena's blood instantly ran cold. The color drained completely from her face. "Lord Reginald Hastings," she gasped, her hands gripping the edges of her blanket in absolute panic. "He is early. He has come with his carriage to collect me to settle my uncle's ledgers." A low, dangerous, distinctly animalistic snarl vibrated deep in Gareth's chest. The sound made the fine hairs on the back of Rowena's neck stand up. "Let him come," the Alpha King commanded, rising to his full, towering height, a lethal, terrifyingly calm smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I am exceedingly eager to meet the man who believes he can purchase what belongs to me." Outside, the opulent, velvet-draped carriage of Lord Reginald Hastings came to a screeching, abrupt halt at the edge of the village square. Hastings, a bloated, heavily perfumed nobleman dripping in stolen royal jewels, stepped out into the freezing mud. He immediately stopped, his face contorting in utter confusion and mounting horror as he took in the sight of the heavily crippled royal guard and the shattered remnants of the tavern. "What in the name of the gods happened here?" Hastings shrieked, his high-pitched voice piercing the cold morning air. He turned his furious gaze toward the ruined tannery. "Barnaby, get out here, you pathetic wretch, and bring me the girl. I have not travelled in this freezing wasteland to stand amidst a battlefield." The door of the tannery swung completely open, creaking ominously on its last remaining hinge. But it was not the cowardly Barnaby who emerged, nor was it a subservient, beaten peasant girl. Gareth stepped out into the morning light, his dark cloak billowing menacingly in the winter wind. He walked with the slow, deliberate, terrifyingly confident stride of a conqueror, positioning himself directly between Hastings' carriage and the tannery door. Rowena stood timidly in the doorway behind him, completely shielded by his massive, imposing frame. Lord Hastings squinted at the towering figure, immense irritation quickly giving way to absolute paralyzing terror as he recognized the striking, aristocratic facial features and those unmistakable, glowing amber eyes. The rumors of the king's demise had clearly been greatly exaggerated. "King Gareth," Hastings stammered, his heavily powdered face turning the color of old parchment as his knees buckled, sending him crashing into the freezing mud of the square. His heavily armed guards, realizing exactly who stood before them, immediately dropped their weapons and fell to their knees in absolute submission. "Reginald Hastings," Gareth's voice boomed across the silent, terrified village, carrying the absolute weight of undeniable, divine authority. "You have grown incredibly fat and exceptionally bold while skimming taxes from my coffers. And now I find you conspiring with a treacherous usurper and attempting to purchase innocent women as property to satisfy a drunkard's debt. My lord, please, I knew nothing of the usurpers." Hastings began to sob hysterically, crawling backward in the slush. "Silence," Gareth commanded, the single word echoing like a thunderclap. He didn't even draw a weapon. The sheer, overwhelming aura of his alpha presence pressed down on the square, forcing every single villager, guard, and nobleman to press their foreheads to the freezing earth in absolute terror and reverence. Gareth turned his back on the groveling, pathetic lord and walked back to the doorway, extending his hand to Rowena. She looked at his large, scarred palm and then up into his golden eyes. There was no hesitation left in her heart. She placed her small, trembling hand in his. Gareth pulled her gently but firmly against his side, wrapping his cloak around her shivering shoulders, declaring his absolute protection to the entire, watching world. "Hear me, people of Darrowshire!" Gareth roared, his voice echoing off the snow-capped peaks of the Whispering Woods. "The usurper King Ewan's reign of terror officially ends today. I ride for the capital to reclaim my rightful throne and bathe the palace in the blood of traitors. And this woman, Rowena, who showed unparalleled mercy to a dying beast in the freezing dark, shall ride beside me. She is no longer a tanner's discarded ward. She is under my absolute, divine protection, and she shall be crowned the Alpha Queen of the Northern Reaches." The sheer magnitude of the declaration hung heavily in the frosty air. Barnaby, who had finally crawled out of his ruined shop, openly wept in terror at the realization of what he had repeatedly beaten and starved. He had tormented a queen, and his reckoning would be legendary. As Gareth lifted Rowena effortlessly onto the back of a captured royal stallion, she looked back at the jagged, frozen peaks of the Whispering Woods one final time. She had ventured into the deadly cold, expecting to merely survive another miserable day. Instead, she had unraveled a massive royal conspiracy, saved the life of a monstrous legend, and unknowingly captured the fiercely loyal heart of the most powerful, dangerous king in the entire realm. Her miserable, abusive past was officially dead, buried beneath the winter snow, leaving only the fierce, golden dawn of her magnificent new reign. Will Rowena and Gareth successfully overthrow the treacherous King Ewan and survive the dangerous royal court? Or will the shadows of betrayal tear them apart before she can claim her crown? Their epic, blood-soaked journey is only just beginning. If you are absolutely captivated by this thrilling tale of hidden royalty, dangerous secrets, and fierce werewolf romance, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this incredible video with your fellow fantasy lovers. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below.